So soil is the foundation. We're going to talk about testing your soil, amending it, and maintaining it, because it is your most crucial asset that you have in a soil-based system. And if you're doing hydroponic or aquaponic gardening, well, then that's a different situation. But probably 99% of people are trying to grow their produce in soil. I like to share a few nuggets that I've learned over the years, and one of these is my favorite here. Success is getting what you want, but happiness is wanting what you get. And you have to think about that. There's always more. You can always want more, but after a few years, you realize that doesn't make you happy, and happiness is a choice, and you choose to be happy with what you have. My job as an agricultural agent, and I do a lot of work with small farmers, my job is to turn the romance that many people have about farming, about soil health, and about a lot of different things, and turn that into reality, because it's never as simple as it sounds. So you'll probably hear a few things from me tonight that you maybe haven't heard before and maybe don't want to hear again. But I want to give you the truth based off of the science and evidence. So I said I work for University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences in Sarasota County, and it is a partnership between the county and the university. And what our role is to provide education and outreach and to disseminate the research and knowledge that's gained at the university from their experimental trials and make that available to the public, to the taxpayer. So we've got many different programs here at Extension. As I said, I head up the agriculture program. We also have another one on sustainability, so waste reduction, energy conservation. Also have programs around gardening and horticulture, and a lot of programs within natural resources, ecology, waste reduction, maritime, water resources. We also do some things in nutrition and healthy living. You're probably aware of the SNAP program in family and consumer sciences. And our most probably well-known program in youth development is 4-H. These are some of the logos and banners that you probably see around the community. So you see 4-H down there at the bottom. You also may know of the Florida Master Gardener program, and they work at our community gardens and out in our communities to provide additional education to gardeners beyond what our agents can do. So we're trying to improve our communities in many, many different ways. So I mentioned we're part of IFAS, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. So I cover agronomic crops, vegetables and herbs, livestock, but also aquaculture, aquaponics, tropical fruits, citrus, and bees, and other things. My specific program is divided into 3 different buckets. About 25% of my time is with cattle ranchers. About half of it is with vegetable producers and also small farmers, people who have ranchettes, just a couple acres, but they may have a couple cows, some horses, and they want to make sure that their pasture is supporting their animals. And then the last bucket is ag awareness, making sure that the city folk know what's going on out on our farms and ranches, and also do some work on food systems and edible gardening. This is a listing of some of my upcoming classes. Some of these have already passed, but if you want to open your camera, take a picture of the QR code, that will show you some of my upcoming courses that I have scheduled for the coming probably 6 months. So if you want to follow more of our programs, you can get that link there or the QR code to stay informed. And lastly, IFAS is an equal opportunity institution, and we believe in justice for all. So as I mentioned, tonight we're going to talk about soil, and we're going to break it up into some different parts. The first part of our agenda, we're going to talk about soil composition. So what are you starting from? What are you starting from? We'll talk about soil evaluation, nutrient deficiencies, soil health, amendments. What can you add to your soil to make it better? We'll talk about how to maintain good soil health and soil fertility. We'll also talk about cover crops, which people like to talk about. And we'll talk a little bit about the realities of cover crops. And then I'll give you some resources for future reading and watching. So our learning objectives are to talk about Florida soils tonight. We'll talk about compost and fertilizer. We'll talk about how important pH is as you evaluate a soil. We'll go through a soil test report and talk about the recommendations that come on a test report and what do you do about them. We'll talk about essential plant nutrients and how to monitor what's going on in your field and look for nutrient deficiencies so that you know what to apply and how to treat your plant. And we'll talk about some other specific nutrient deficiencies as well. So the Florida geology and soils are divided into 4 general categories: Panhandle, Central Ridge, Peninsula, and Everglades. We are in the flatwood soils area, and most of our soils in this area are a mica fine sand, which happens to be the state soil. Maybe you didn't know we have one. But it is, as it's described, heavily composed of sand. In some areas, there may be some organic matter and some topsoil if it's been under permanent ground cover like a pasture or a natural area. But if it's been farmed, if it's been tilled, it's probably going to be mostly beach sand. So let's talk about soil composition. What does your soil look like? And these are some important soil terms. And we'll talk about these: particle size, texture, pore space, compaction, organic matter, soil pH, and in certain parts of Florida, such as our coastal counties, salinity can be an issue as well. So when we look at the soil composition, it's generally divided into 2 halves, meaning the solids and the pore space, and they make up about 50% each. And in the pore space, about 20% of it is water, and about 20% of it is air. And of course, that fluctuates. And when it comes to the solids in your soil, about 45% is mineral. And in a typical soil, about 5% is organic. In Florida, our typical organic matter concentration in our mica fine sand is less than 1%. And that's where we have some challenges with growing in our soils here in Southwest Florida. And we'll talk more about that. Soil texture, what that describes is the size of soil particles in that mineral fraction, what makes up that mineral fraction. And here, as I've mentioned several times already, we are down in that lower left-hand corner there, very sandy, with some loamy sand, unless you're in the Everglades or an organic soil or muck soil. But most of what we're dealing with here in Southwest Florida is sand and loamy sand. And organic matter, that's what makes our soils productive. That's what makes our plants grow. And we want to maximize that organic matter in our soils. And we'll talk about some ways that we can do that. How can we improve it? How can we maintain it? And why organic matter is so important is that organic matter has what's called a cation exchange capacity. And what that does is it's charged, and it will then attract the opposite charge of the nutrients that are in the soil. And then it will hold those nutrients in the soil. But and you can look at these words here, and the size of the print means it has a higher cation exchange capacity. So if we have organic matter, look at the size of that print versus clay and versus sand. And organic matter can have between 4 to 50 times higher cation exchange capacity than clay and more than sand. So a problem in most of our sandy soils is there's nothing to hold those nutrients there. So when we have our rains, our 2 and 3 and 4 inch rains, the nutrients you just put on, in many cases, go right through the profile and into our groundwater, into our rivers, our lakes, our estuaries, and our bays. So we want to have that organic matter for lots of different reasons. And that's to keep these cations staying in the soil and make them available for plant growth and keep them out of our waterways. Also, cation exchange capacity can decline as pH goes down. We also have some acidic soils in this part of Florida as well. So when you add up sandy soil, low organic matter, and low pH, you can see we have a challenge. Also, if you're coming from an HOA or an urban area, most likely the soils you're dealing with in your backyard garden are compacted from the construction that was done. And they may be poor drainage. They may have a non-fertile fill that was put in there. So they're generally not a good place to start with. And when we talk about soil fertility, this is the contrast. You can see sandy soils on the left and organic with that rich A horizon, that top soil profile there where it's black and has lots of texture and aggregate, and it hangs together, and that can go down 8, 10, 12 inches or more. So when we're talking about soil health, and we're going to talk more about it in a little while, what we're really talking about is how can we feed all of the flora and fauna that are in the soil. So what are we going to do to feed the fungi, the arthropods, the bacteria that are going to help break down all of that organic matter? And then when that organic matter breaks down and it becomes inorganic, then the plants can take it up. So we'll talk about how can we feed that soil web. And when we talk about our soils and we talk about plant growth and crop development, there are 17 essential nutrients that we're concerned about. And these are listed here. Some being macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which need to be in the soil to have productive growth. And these can often be lacking, especially in our sandy soils. And then we also have some micronutrients, and once in a while these can be lacking. And that's why we do a soil test to determine what is going on in our soil, and we'll talk more about that. So I mentioned the cation exchange capacity. And as you look here, you'll see the positive ions will go attached to the soil particles, the organic matter, and stay in the soil. But our nitrates and sulfates can move through the soil, and that's why we get nitrate and phosphates and sulfate in our water. But not so much calcium, magnesium, and manganese. They kind of stay where they attach to the soil particles, if we have good cation exchange capacity. And when we talk about organic matter, not all organic matter is the same. Some of it is already broken down and stabilized. Some of it is in the process of decomposing. Some is actually living organisms like fungi, mycorrhiza, and bacteria. And some is just a plant material that has just died, fresh roots, fresh stems, fresh leaves. And that organic matter manages water like a sponge. And here's a startling fact. Every 1% increase in organic matter results in about 25,000 gallons of available soil water per acre. So as I said, many of our soils around here are less than 1%. I'm originally from Minnesota. We have soils that are 5% organic matter. So you do that math and you find out that those soils can hold 125,000 gallons more of water after a rain than what we can hold here. That's a challenge for us. So to do a little quiz here, just throw your guess into the chat box. So number one at the top here, and this is the composition on average of our soil beneath our feet. What's number one? I went through this a few slides back. What's number one? What is that category? It makes up about 50%. And it's composed of number 3 and number 5 on the list there. Any guesses? Okay, number 1 is the pore space. What's number 2? If it's not pore space, then it must be what? Solids. Okay, the solids. Number 3, what does this look like? Just throw it in the chat. What's number 3? Number 3 is air. What's number 5? We'll stay on the same side here. Number 5. And number 5 is, yes, water, absolutely. How about 4 and 6? Just put those in the chat. 4 and 6 are what? Mineral and organic matter, absolutely. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about soil maps. And these are available to you. We have a soil map that was done decades ago for Sarasota County. They don't give you a lot of information, and they don't tell you what has changed in the soil over the past 4 or 5 decades since the soil map was done. But it is interesting to know where you started from. So here's another resource called Web Soil Survey. And this is available at the nrcs.usda.gov site. And I highly recommend you go there if you have some land, have a plot, or some land that you're interested in buying, to do your homework before you start to amend that soil. So here's Sarasota County. Here's how you go to Web Soil Survey. Just throw that in your Google search and this will come up. I took a farm right across from our extension office here on Clark Road in Sarasota. This is the Underhill Ranch, and they've got about 30 acres. Here's what the soil types are. Okay, so there's 5 acres. That's a Ugale Mayaca fine sand. There's about 11%. That's another version of fine sand. And then about less than an acre that is Ona fine sand. So you see, even in these different categories, it's still one version or another of sand. But it can give you some useful information in terms of slope, what's its best use for, how deep do the different soil profiles go down, the A horizon, the E horizon. And it tells you what the land capability is too. So there's some useful information there. I encourage you to go there and to play around with Web Soil Survey. Also, as you buy a property, it's always useful to find out how that property was used before. So is there any reason to believe that there might be some soil contaminants? Lead, petroleum, pesticides. My younger brother bought an acreage and found a car buried in the backyard. So how's that for uncovering a treasure? But your site might be contaminated, and it could be 5 years ago, it could be 50 years ago. Who knows how many times a property has changed hands. And you can't just say, well, I want to test for contaminants. You have to specify what you want to test for. So you might test for 10 contaminants, and each one of those costs $5, $10, $15, but you don't test for one that is present. So this is not a comprehensive analysis. But if you have reason to believe there might be something there, then test for that. If you think there had been a gas station there, you might want to test for petroleum distillates, as an example. So what initial criteria should be used to judge a field soil? This is a question for you. Just throw the answer 1, 2, 3 in the chat box. What initial criteria should be used to judge a field soil? Which choice here has the most right answers? 1, 2, or 3? It's just got to be 2, right? You can pick it up and smell it, and it looks good, and it had chicken manure applied to it, so it just must be good. Yeah, it's 3. It has the most right answers. What's the soil type? Is it sloped? Is there any highly erodible land? We don't have so much of that here in Southwest Florida, but it does occur some places. What's the organic matter? Are there contaminants? Was it ever disturbed? What's the pH, salinity, fertility? Is it compacted? So there are lots of things to look at to judge your initial soil. So let's talk about soil testing. And we test soil so we can make an informed management decision. I get lots of questions from people that say, what's wrong with my grass? Why isn't it producing? Why are my tomatoes not growing? And I ask them, and they say, should I put on some compost? And the first question I ask them is, have you done a soil test? We don't buy a house without doing an inspection. Why would we start to fix our soil without a soil test and knowing where we're starting from? We're going to spend money and maybe even do more harm than good if we apply, as an example, too much nitrogen and it leaches through our soil. So you always want to do that inspection when you buy the house and also when you start improving your soil. And pH is one of the first things you want to fix because pH affects availability of nutrients. And I'll say more about that here in a minute. So you always want to test your soil before you try to adjust pH. People will also tell me, well, should I put on some dolomite or some calcium carbonate? And the answer is, well, do you have a test? Have you measured what your pH is? If not, then don't do anything. So we want our pH to be between 5.5 and 7. And that's a question too of what you want to grow. What do you want to grow on that pH? If you want to grow blueberries, you want it to be closer to 5 and 5.5. If you want to grow bahia grass in a pasture, you want it to be 5.5. If you want to grow many other vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, many other things, you're probably going to want it between 6 and 7. So you have to ask that question too and answer it. What do I want to grow? And as I said, there are some plants that like more of an acidic soil. So how do you raise the soil pH? You can add cal lime or dolomite. In some cases, you may have a high pH, not very common, but it does occur once in a while. And in those cases, you can add elemental sulfur, iron sulfate, but it's a longer-term process, can be more expensive, and isn't always effective. But fortunately, we don't have a lot of calcareous soils here. Also, as I mentioned, we have some problems with soil salinity in the coastal counties. And as a result of hurricanes like Idalia and Ian, we also have had some movement of saline or salinity inland through our storm surges. So when we get salt water moving across our soil surface and it goes down and penetrates into our soil profile, and that can also raise our salinity levels. And when we have that, the plants can't take up the nutrients as efficiently. If we have high salt, plants may wilt, burn, and they just don't take up nutrients efficiently. And we can test for that here too at our extension office on Clark Road. And if you do have a salt, one thing you can do is leach those salts out with rain or irrigation. You can also test the irrigation water. So if you're going to try to leach out salts in your soils, make sure that your irrigation water isn't already high in salts, because then you're not going to accomplish that purpose. You may also want to choose more salt-tolerant plants. There's not a lot of choices here, but there are some that are very sensitive. There are some that are tolerant, and then there's some that'll do fairly well in salt. So the University of Florida Soil Testing Lab tests soil for pH, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, but not nitrogen. We don't have a real good test for nitrogen. So you can take a soil sample, bring it in here to our office, and we'll test it for pH and salinity here on site, or you can send it up to UF and get a more thorough analysis. And if you want to do a soil test, you can call me and I can bring out some soil bags and the forms. Here's what you're going to fill out. And it's going to ask for this information. So give the sample ID a name, what county, what crop are you trying to grow, how big of an area is it, and what kind of a test do you want to have done. And you also want to sample your lawn or garden or field in a representative way. So you want to take 5 or 6 or 7 samples, depending on the size of what you want to measure. And that is then going to be put into a plastic pail, mixed up, and then you'll take out about a half a pint of that and put it into a cloth or paper bag and label it. And then you can send that off with this form. Okay? But you want to make sure that You're sampling the area representatively, and that's where a soil map comes in handy, and that you can lay your soil map down and say, well, I've got two different types of soil, and these two parts of the field are different. One's lower, one's higher. Then you should take one sample to keep it separate in the lower area and one sample and keep it separate in the higher area. Might cost you a little bit more, but then you can adjust your fertilizer applications to match what you really need. So how do you interpret that soil test? So the test is going to come back like this. It's going to show you parts per million of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. It'll also show you the pH up here at the top. In this case, the pH is about 7.9. That tends to be a little high. And depending on what you want to grow, in this case, we said hemp, and the target pH is about 6.5. So in this case, you may want to bring that pH down or plant something different. But it'll tell you what the actual level of nutrients is or are, and it'll then tell you what do you need to apply in order to grow the crop that you want to grow, in this case, hemp. So if you have 1 acre, you'd want to apply 90 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of potassium, and you should be ready to go. And then there are directions here too on how to apply it, when to apply it. Maybe you want to do it in a split application. You want to do it at the right time of year. We don't generally fertilize in March and April because it's very dry. We don't generally fertilize during the summer, and many of you are familiar with our moratoriums on fertilizing in the summer anyway, from June through September, because our heavy rains will move it right through the profile and into our groundwater. So lots of information in these soil test reports. And if you send it in from Sarasota County, I get copied on it, and I can go through the report with you and make recommendations. What questions do you have at this point? Let's take a little break, and you can unmute and ask your question or throw a question in the chat about whatever we've covered so far. Okay, let's keep moving. So your soil test, what does it mean? Well, as I mentioned, pH is very important, and it tells you what the availability of nutrients are going to be in your soil. So if it's too high or too low, the plant may not be able to effectively take up the nutrients it needs. So look at this diagram. I know it's kind of busy, but look at the width of the line, and you'll see right around 6 to 7 or so, that most nutrients are widely available. But as you go more alkaline soils or more acidic soils, you'll see those lines narrow, and that means those nutrients are less available to the plant. So if you have a soil that's actually at 5.5, let's just go right down there. Look at that. But phosphorus is not very available. Magnesium is not very available. And you start to see a drop off in nitrogen, potassium, and in sulfur. So that pH is the first thing you want to try to fix. So why is soil testing so important? As we're talking about testing our soil and getting a report and interpreting it, why is standard soil testing so important? Just throw your answer in the chat. 1, 2, or 3. Yes, so obviously 3, right? You want to test to make sure your pH is optimal. You want to make sure that the required nutrients, the macro and the micro, are present at the right level. And it helps you make evidence-based decisions. You don't want to apply more lime than you have to. You don't want to apply more nutrients, compost or fertilizer, than you have to. It's a waste of money, and it can be harmful on the environment. So let's talk about nutrient deficiencies. And the best thing that you can do is always be out in your garden. So I was out at a small farm incubator that we have up at the Moat Aquaculture Park, and we were looking at some of the tomatoes and the peppers and basil, and I noticed some of the basil leaves were at the lower part of the plant were turning yellow. So from this chart here, if it's turning yellow, what do you think that might mean in the lower levels? Yeah, it says it most likely is a nitrogen deficiency. So you can be your own plant doctor, so to speak, by looking at the symptoms that the plant shows you. The symptom is your, or the plant is your patient. You can look at it and get their symptoms and then decide what's missing, what's deficient. Here's another way to look at this, and you can look at not just nutrient deficiencies, but also what about levels of carbon dioxide? What about insect damage? What about too much sun, too little sun? Here's a nice little flow chart, and I will make these slides available to you tomorrow morning. But you can use this to step by step go through and determine diagnostically what is the nutrient deficiency. So is it on the older leaves or is it on the newer leaves? If it's on the newer leaves, are the leaves distorted? Are they wavy? Or are they just turning yellow? And then that'll kind of lead you to what might be the issue. And we need nitrogen for green leaves to be fast growing. It's probably our most important plant nutrient when it comes to productivity, right? Plants can stay alive with less nitrogen, but if you want to get a lot of tomatoes, you want to grow a lot of grass for your cows, whatever it might be, nitrogen needs to be there to get that full growth. And we can see here the plant on the right is nitrogen deficient. Phosphorus is necessary for flowers and roots and photosynthesis. And if you have a phosphate deficiency or phosphorus deficiency, it'll oftentimes turn leaves kind of purplish. And you see the plant here with purple undersides. Potassium is important for fruit quality, also can be helpful in disease prevention. So the best way to make your plants more resistant to diseases is to make sure that they are as healthy as possible, just like a human. The healthier we are, the more fit, we manage our weight, we exercise, we eat right. Surprise, surprise, we have less disease issues in general. So here's a sign of a calcium deficiency in tomatoes. Calcium helps transport and store other nutrients. So you might have good NPK levels in your soil, but if you have a calcium deficiency, the plant can't transport that NP and K. So all of these things go together. That's why it's never as simple as it sounds. Some other things to look at there. Magnesium, important for photosynthesis. And in magnesium, we see what we call interveinal chlorosis. So you'll see the veins that run parallel on a leaf here like corn, and in between those veins, it turns yellow. So that striping is very indicative of magnesium. Okay. Sulfur, important for growth, also cold resistance, a sign of some sulfur deficiencies. Iron, pretty important for chlorophyll production. We know that's absolutely crucial for plant growth. Let's look at some common nutrient deficiency symptoms in Florida. So the first plant on the left there looks like what? Lower leaves are yellow. The middle one, also more yellowing. The one upper right, see some yellowing in the margins. Bottom left, looks like some interveinal chlorosis. The same on the lower right, kind of looks like interveinal chlorosis. So what do you think that first one is in the upper left? What's that symptom look like? Yeah, it's nitrogen. It's a nitrogen deficiency. It's the lower leaves turning yellow. What about the middle one? What do you think that is? That's actually potassium that shows up like that. And some people have said in the past, well, maybe that's one of those ferns that turns yellow, right? So you really have to know what's the plant you're dealing with before you start to judge the symptoms too. Next one is magnesium. What about the lower left one? What do you think that is? What is deficiency is present on the lower left one? That's manganese. How about the lower right? As the intervenal chlorosis. Very common symptom of iron deficiency. And here are some more characterizations or diagrams showing iron deficiency. Yes, absolutely. So does that mean that you're short of iron in your soil? The answer to that is not necessarily. You might have adequate iron, but your pH is not correct. So if your pH is 8.5 and you have a calcareous soil, look at the availability of iron at that high pH. So you may have iron in the soil, but because of the pH, the plant can't access it. So that's why we always try to change our pH first, because that affects so many other things. So let's talk about soil health, right? That's very important. And we can unequivocally say that soil is alive. And there are some figures that there is many living organisms in a spoonful of soil as there are stars in the sky, neurons in your brain. It's just phenomenal. I don't know which one of those numbers is more amazing. But a spoonful of soil, a healthy soil, has lots of living organisms in it. Yeah, here's more people on Earth, more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Pretty amazing in healthy soil. So let's look at the soil movement of nutrients. So we might have a legume plant that fixes nitrogen, and then that nitrogen is released into the soil profile. And then the nutrients can, the plant matter, organic matter can also be broken down, decomposed. And then the nitrogen fixing bacteria and other decomposers break it down into nitrites and nitrates. And that's what's actually taken up by the plants. So when we apply compost and organic matter, and you might find that it doesn't, your plants don't look so great right away, it's because that organic matter has to be made into inorganic form before the plant can take it up. Okay, so you need to understand that compost isn't immediately available when you plant into it. It depends on how the compost was made and how well it was done. So we can have mycorrhizal fungi in our root systems, and in certain areas, they can almost overtake the soil. In other areas, like here in Florida, not so much because of our sand and lack of organic matter. But they can be very important in creating soil health. Also, nitrogen bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria are very important. We have some free fixers. We have others that are symbiotic. I planted some sun hemp as ground cover at our small farm incubator at Moat, and it is a legume, so it's going to be fixing nitrogen, and we hope if we continue to do it over time, it'll improve the nitrogen content as well as the organic matter. But the key is it has to be done over a period of time. These things aren't quick fixes. To build soil health, you got to keep it covered. The last thing you want to do is just till. And we can think about a hurricane. So when a hurricane comes across our landscape, like down at Fort Myers Beach, right, it just destroyed everything in its path. As you do tillage in a soil, it's like a hurricane going through that community of soil microorganisms. You're just ripping it all apart, tearing apart all of their structures, all of the humus, the aggregate materials that they have put together there, and then it dries out, gets hot, and it cooks that bacteria. So one of the best things you can do is keep it covered. And we want to build organic matter, and there's different ways to do that. If you have a pasture and you want to improve soil health, you need to understand, well, what are you trying to do with your pasture? Is it productivity? Is it ground cover? Is it to keep the weeds down? Is it habitat? You may not be able to do all of those equally well at the same time. But covering that soil is critical, and minimizing disturbance is critical for soil health. Also, as you increase plant and animal diversity, the differences in the bacteria, in manure, in the type of organic matter can help stimulate different types of soil microorganisms. And you want to keep actively growing roots in that soil as much as possible. And then in some models, you may want to integrate livestock if it's possible. Here's a cute little way to determine how much organic or how much soil microbe activity you have in your soil. And you can just take some cotton underwear and you bury it. So the one on the left is pre-burial, and then at different points and different types of soil with different soil microbial activity. The ones on the left says it's not breaking down that cotton. There's not much microbial activity. The one on the right, there's lots of activity, and those bacteria and other flora and fauna in the soil are just destroying that cotton. So if you're an educator and you want to make a point with students or even adults, you can do this test, and it's a great one to demonstrate the value of microorganisms and the differences in your soil. So what are the principles to improve soil health? Choose which answer contains the most right answers. 1, 2, or 3? Which one will help you the most to improve soil health? Yes, number 2, right? It's not just put on some black cow, pour on some mycorrhizae, do some compost tea. I hear all of these things over and over and over, and it's just wasted money. It's just wasted money. You have to start with the basics, and then you can fine tune with these other things. But minimize soil disturbance, cover the soil, maximize growing roots, add diversity, and then think about adding compost, litter, manure, other organic matter. So let's talk about some of those things that you can add to improve plant productivity and improve your soils. So fertilizer use, we can use organic, non-synthetic materials that are approved by OMRI, that are organic certified. You can make that choice. You don't have to do that. Or you can use inorganic or synthetic fertilizers. And some people say, in no way, no how. Well, we can't always be absolutists. Sometimes we have to be relativists. And we have to be utilitarian. And think about how can we do things that are the greatest good for the greatest number. And I'll tell you why I say that here in a minute. So should you use organic or inorganic? The answer to that is yes. You can feed the soil with organic fertilizers, organic matter, and you can feed the plant immediately and in the season when you're growing with synthetic fertilizers. If you're going to be organic certified, then you leave all of that possibility on the right side off your list of options. And then you have to make sure that your organic fertilizers are fitting the bill. So synthetic fertilizer contributes to around half of all food production around the world. So if we decided, oh, we're going to be organic because that's got to be the way to go to save our environment, we are going to be harming billions of people, vulnerable people around the world who count on human-made non-organic fertilizers. It's just the reality. So think about that as you're thinking about being an absolutist. Also, we don't have to be either or. We can use inorganic fertilizers and use the right fertilizers, and I'll say more about this, the right fertilizers at the right rate, at the right time, and the right place, and you'll find out we don't get any in our groundwater. And we get good plant growth. And we can still stimulate soil health and soil microorganism growth. It's not either or. So if you're going to use synthetic fertilizer, which I think should be an option for you unless you're certified organic, only purchase what you need, apply it as directed at the right time and to the right plant in the right place. When you do that, you're more efficient and you leave a much less environmental footprint as well. It's good for your pocketbook and good for your community and our water. Let's look at some different fertilizer terms. You may have a blend. You're going to have a grade that measures what's in that fertilizer, and you're going to have a ratio of the different components of that fertilizer. So it might be water soluble, it might be slow release, or it could be encapsulated. So what does all that mean? So if you look at all-purpose plant food from Miracle-Gro, look at it, it has 24% nitrogen, has about 8% phosphorus, 16% potash. And I'll explain what this means here. So you need to understand what's in that fertilizer. So here's a sample fertilizer label. It says 1608. This is what you might find at Home Depot or even Big Earth or whatever supply center you're going to. So the grade is 16% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, 8% potassium. So it's a 201. Is it complete? No, because it doesn't have any phosphorus. If your soil test report says you need phosphorus, you don't want to apply this. And it has about 50% of that N is slowly releasing. And I've used this, it's called polymer-coated urea. And it'll release it over 90 days through the growing season. So you don't have to think about, oh, that rain's going to come down and wash it all away. No, it isn't, because it's going to stay in the soil if you have some organic matter, and it's going to be released over time. It's not either or. And it may not be water soluble immediately, so it won't move through when you have that heavy rain. So some bottom lines when you're looking at using fertilizer: read it, follow the directions, follow our recommendations, fertilize only as needed based on your soil test report. Use fertilizers that contain slow or controlled release N and low P. And of course, keep fertilizer off of hard surfaces. Don't fertilize established trees if you're fertilizing your lawn. And fertilize according to your soil test. Don't put on a complete fertilizer if you only need phosphorus. Okay? So let's look at this sample fertilizer label. What's the grade here? What's the grade of it? We just went through this. The grade is 1608. What's the ratio? Right? You remember the ratio? 201. It has 2 parts of nitrogen, 0 parts phosphorus, 1 part potassium. What percent is slowly available? It's that nitrogen that's coated with polymers, and that's 50%. And it's a polymer-coated urea. And then it has secondary nutrients. What are the secondary nutrients that are in this fertilizer? Sulfur, iron, and manganese. So you need to become fluent at reading fertilizer labels. Any questions at this point about a soil test, about a fertilizer label, about soil health, microorganisms? Okay, so let's talk about soil amendments and talk specifically about compost. So when we really talk about organic fertilizers, what that means is they're based off of organic material. So something that was living before. It doesn't necessarily mean it's certified organic. Okay, there's a big difference there. We can use organic materials that come from compost that we get from the landfill, and it's organic, may have 30% organic material in it, but it's certainly not going to be certifiable for organic production. So there, we have a little bit of misunderstanding there in terms of what's organic and what's not. So we want to use compost. Many people do. It is that decomposed material that microorganisms break down, but it doesn't always break it down completely, or it takes time to break it down, which is good, right? That way it feeds the microorganisms in your soil. But compost has to be made in the right way. So if it's going to use animal manure as a starting point, you want to make sure that that carbon to nitrogen ratio, that green to brown, is in the right ratio. And you want to make sure that you have a temperature to cook everything in that compost. And the reason for that is to destroy any disease spores, is to destroy any weed seeds, to break down any bacteria that might be there from the manure. And if you don't do that, then you may have some problems, especially with weed seed. And you can use raw manure, but it has to be used 90 to 120 days prior to harvest. You can also use vermicompost. There's lots of different things that you can use, but you should get it tested so you know what you're doing. Okay. So here just repeats what I said. You want to make sure you have air and water as well as the heat. And this is an example of a compost bin and how to put it together. And one of my colleagues here in our office teaches composting classes all the time. I suggest you go to our Eventbrite page where you found my class and look for composting. And if you want to do it, we've got classes going on every month. But composting has to be done in the right way. It's just like cover crops. It's just like soil health. It's like fertilizing. It has to be done in the right way to get the benefits from it. And here are some symptoms of things that can go wrong and what the cause is and what you need to do about it. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight. I strongly encourage you to take one of our composting classes. Let's talk about mulch a little bit. This is one of the key tools for gardening in Florida. Because of our direct sunlight, our high temperatures, our hours of sunlight every day, and because our soils are sand-based, they can dry out very quickly. And the heat at that soil level destroys all of the microorganisms too. Microorganisms in soils are just like people. We like to have the temperature between about 60 to 85. When our soil temps get up to 100, which can happen if they're not covered, then that kills the soil microorganisms. So you're defeating the purpose, right? Just like 100-degree ocean water kills the coral. We have to pay attention to that. And a good layer of mulch can help preserve moisture, prevent weeds, and keep that temperature lower. And you can see the left-hand side without mulch, the right-hand side with mulch. And just the better crop that's growing here, it's just a night and day. You can use things like pine straw. You want to put it on 2 to 5 inches thick. You don't want to necessarily mix it into your soil because it's going to be acidic. Maybe you can use that over time to bring down an alkaline soil. You can use wood chips, but remember that that's high in carbon, low in nitrogen. So as the microorganisms start to break down that carbon, they're going to steal nitrogen in the soil profile away from your plants. And you might see your plants turning yellow, especially those lower leaves, when you have a lot of wood mulch that's starting to break down into the soil because it's starving that soil for nitrogen. So be aware of that. Mulching benefits, which ones do you think apply here? Which of these boxes would you check as benefits of mulch? Okay, most of them, right? Moisture retention, soil temperature moderation, improved organic matter, weed suppression, disease prevention, erosion control. I wish it gave me a better love life and let me retire earlier, but I haven't seen it yet. What are factors to consider when mulching your garden? Choose the one with the most right answers. What do you think? What do you need to consider when mulching your garden? And you may say, why is mulching important to soil? Well, it's that ground cover. It protects it keeps the water in the soil. It keeps the temperature down. It does a lot of things for protecting and building soil. That's why we talk about mulching in a soils class. So what answers here? Could be one or it could be three. What are your objectives? What mulch is available? What's the cost of the mulch? What's the source? Is it certified organic? How thick do you want to put it on? What does it look like? If you want to use oak leaves or pine needles, well, what does that look like? Maybe you want to have regular wood chips. Some people care as much about how it looks as what it does. So let's talk about cover crops. Very popular topic now, and rightly so. It can be very beneficial. And you'll see the emphasis on the word here, can. We talk about some of these things as if they're absolutely going to happen, that there's a cause and then 100% effect, that there are causation there. But they have to be done right, in the right way and over time in order to see the benefits. It drives me nuts when I hear somebody say, eat this because it prevents cancer. No, it doesn't. It may help over time lessen your risk of cancer, but it doesn't de facto prevent cancer. And cover crops can improve soil health, can supply nitrogen, reduce leaching, reduce erosion, can suppress pests, can attract beneficial insects. Why do I say can? Because it depends. They can provide nitrogen, okay? And they can regulate soil temperatures. They can also help you control weeds if you use them for weed suppression. Here are some examples of good cover crops that can be grown in Florida. I mentioned I have a cover crop right now of sun hemp. You can use indigo, you can use cowpea, sorghum Sudan grass. There's a number of things that you can use, but you have to get a stand, okay? It doesn't matter if you spread sun hemp down and only one of every 4 plants germinates and grows. So I planted sun hemp about a month ago. Guess what? We got 2 inches of rain the next day. It jumped out of the ground. It emerged. We've not had a single rain since then. And it's starting to slow down. If it doesn't germinate and emerge and grow and fill in the landscape, then it doesn't suppress the weeds. It doesn't conserve the moisture. So just because you're doing sun crops doesn't mean you're going to get all the benefits. If I have 1/4 of the number of plants, then I'll get 1/4 of the amount of nitrogen fixed. It's just math. But we talk about ground cover and cover crops as being the next coming, and it's not if it's not done right. It can increase pore space. It can reduce leaching. It can suppress nematodes. So sun hemp is not a host for root knot nematodes. We have some in the property that I've been talking about here tonight. If we don't get anything else to grow there and it's just sun hemp, then we'll break that cycle. If it's only 1/4 of a crop and other root knot nematode host plants can grow, then guess what? The root knot nematodes survive. So here are some unintended consequences or challenges in cover crops. Sometimes it's tough to get them seeded and established. I just gave you a real life example. Hasn't rained in a month. Sometimes you want it to overwinter, sometimes you don't. And they can contaminate the following crop if they're not killed. What if they come to seed? Well, then that seed becomes a weed in the following crop. Sometimes they can attract insects, or they're allelopathic, meaning they may elicit root chemicals that are hazardous to other plants. We use cereal rye as a cover crop, but when corn is planted after cereal rye, there's an allelopathic effect. The details matter. So here's the pros, and here are the cons, which I again mentioned. Remember, I'm trying to bring reality to your romance. That it depends on the timing. What about the cost of the seed? You don't just do these things. You have to have equipment to work the ground, to spread the seeding, or to drill it in. What about adapted cultivars? And oftentimes the pros here, the things that cover crops can do, take years and much investment before you build organic matter, before you increase nitrogen, before you improve soil health. Just make sure you know your tick cut or what you're biting off here to chew as you take on cover crops. So what are the factors to consider when using cover crops? Choose the one with the most right answers. What do you think? Yes, it's number 4, right? It's number 4. So all of these things have to be done right in order to get cover crops to work. Just trying to bring reality to romance. Practice to theory. So let's summarize. So we talked about soil composition. What are you starting from? What's the mineral makeup? What level of organic matter? What about the pore space, the water space, right? All of those things matter. So what are you starting from? And then doing an evaluation. You don't buy a house without an inspection. You shouldn't do anything to your soil without a soil test and an inspection. The best thing you can be is a plant doctor and recognize the symptoms of what your plants are telling you. Are they short of nitrogen? Add nitrogen. Are they short of sulfur? Add sulfur. A lot of that information can come from your soil test, but your plants can also tell you what's going on. And what else do you need to know about nutrient deficiencies? Before you apply iron, because it's showing iron deficiency chlorosis, what do you need to do? What do you need to know? You need to know your pH, right? Because the iron may be present in the soil, but it's not available because of a high pH. Soil health, very important, but it starts with good organic matter, ground cover, good moisture, keeping the temperature low, and you have to build it over time. But it can be very powerful. For a healthy soil, can lead to great plant productivity and to healthy soils, but it takes time to build it. Amendments, using inorganic fertilizer, organic fertilizer, combinations of the two. Make sure that you're not trying to be an absolutist. You can use timed release nitrogen. You can use inorganic fertilizers at the right rate, the right source, at the right time, in the right place, and protect your water and still fertilize your plants and your soil. Lots of details. And then maintaining the soil, ground cover, as an example, mulching, composting. Talked about cover crops already. They have to be done right in order to get the benefits. And resources. Here are some more resources for you. As I said, I will send you the link to the PowerPoint or to the PDF, but lots of different things, resources on getting soil testing done, on maps, resources on soil health, and then some of our key resources on Florida gardening, vegetable gardening in Florida, organic methods for vegetable gardening, and many of our planting guides from the University of Florida. So what questions do you have as we start to wrap up? Here's a question. Is a soil map just a map of where you pulled samples from? If you go to the Web Soil Survey, it will show you the map of the entire soil profile, or the entire soil on your farm. Okay, so that'll be everything that has been mapped. When you do a soil test, it's only going to represent where you took the samples. So if you only sampled half an acre, then that information is only going to be about that half acre. If you sample from 5 acres, then it's going to be about those 5 acres. But make sure you don't mix soil types or real differences in soil. A low soil from a high one, a very sandy beach sand area from one that has more ground cover, more organic matter, you'll want to split those and send in 2 samples. Anything else? So yes, I see a pun here. The information on soil was very deep. I like that. Thank you. Okay. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, folks, thank you for tonight. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.